Thanks, Dave, and thanks for coming out. I'd also like to thank my colleagues who worked on this report with me, David Ezekiel, a policy associate with the Public Policy Institute of California, and Belinda Reyes, who is director of the Cesar Chavez Center at San Francisco State University. And again, I'd like to thank our funders, too, the James Irvine Foundation and the Donald Bren Foundation. So what I'm going to do is give a brief presentation highlighting the findings of the report. And as Dave mentioned, you have the report there. On the website, we actually also have some appendices to the report that have all kinds of fascinating information and tables and some maps of how these patterns that I'm going to talk about for the state look regionally within California. It seems to me that when we talk about higher education and higher education issues in the United States and in California and in Sacramento, there's two very disparate conversations going on. In one set of conversations, there is a general consensus and a discussion that we need more students to go to college and we need more students to graduate from college. And a lot of those discussions are about workforce issues, and there's a broad consensus that we need to see more college going and graduation, and that runs from chambers of commerce and businesses to higher education advocates. And in our own public opinion polling at PPIC, we see that the people of California are very much concerned about and identify the value of higher education in California. Another set of conversations is about how we are going to cut higher education budgets. And that is, of course, also a kind of policy discussion and maybe a more immediate policy discussion. And that's a policy discussion and decision that's taking place not just in Sacramento, but in state capitals throughout the United States. And so we have these two very, I would say, very dissonant kind of conversations. And the goal of this project was to try to connect the dots and answer the question, how has the budget cuts that we've seen in higher education in California affected college enrollment? So the main finding is that cuts to higher education have taken a toll. The cuts have been pretty substantial, and the institutions in California have responded in a variety of ways. From a student's perspective and from a student's family perspective, the most dramatic ways that those institutions have responded is through increases in tuition and fees and enrollment management techniques, and we're going to talk about all these as I go through the highlights of the report. In the end, those responses of the institutions, which are in turn responses to the budget cuts that they faced from declines in general fund support from the state, have led to enrollment declines of first-time freshmen, especially at UC and CSU. And again, we'll get into more of the detail there. The overall context then for what's happening in California with respect to college going needs to be considered in light of the larger economy that we're in. And certainly while we're in a downturn now, it is the case that college graduates are still doing far better than people who have not graduated from college. PPIC has developed some projections that are highlighted in previous reports we've done that suggests that if our economy continued to change along the path that it has been on for many decades, by 2025, about 40% of all jobs in California would require a bachelor's degree or more. And at the same time, our population is changing in ways, and our higher education institutions are changing in ways that make it unlikely that we will be able to supply that demand. So that equates to a shortfall of about 1 million college graduates with a bachelor's degree. There are additional shortfalls of people with other kinds of post-secondary credentials, including associate's degrees or certificates. So the big picture is an economy and a world that's increasingly demanding more highly skilled and more highly educated workers, and yet our state systems are not really responding to those changes. In reality, in 2025, supply will equal demand, and either we will have a state that's more prosperous with higher incomes and less demand for social services, or we will have a state that has lower incomes, lower tax revenues, and more demands for services. One piece of good news is that the demand for college is increasing, and this is the other very important kind of contextual item for understanding the dynamics of what's happening with college enrollment and institutional responses to cuts in budgets. Students and their families are applying to and eligible for UC and CSU in ever greater numbers. This chart shows the share of high school graduates applying to and eligible for UC and CSU from the mid-1990s to the most current year that we have data for. And you'll see that at CSU, that share has grown from 19% to over 29%. At UC, that share has grown from 12% to 16%. Remember that the master plan guidelines are that the top 1/8 of high school students should be eligible for UC. For example, the top 1/3 should be eligible for CSU. Here we see, in the case of UC, more than the top 1/8, about the top 1/6 or 1/7, 16% of high school graduates are not only eligible for UC, they're actually eligible and applying to UC. So that's actually good news. Even though UC is above that master plan threshold, we should be glad. That means that these students are completing the college preparatory requirements, the A through G requirements of UC and CSU. They're completing them at the sufficient grade point average. They're taking the SAT and passing it at the sufficient level to be eligible for admission to UC. And those percentages are going up. That's great news. The demand for college is there. In this report, we really focus on recent high school graduates. And let me explain at least three reasons why. Shortly after graduating is a key time in an individual's educational pathway in life. That is the moment at which people decide to go to college or not in very large numbers, greater than at any other point in their lifetime. And students who decide to go to college at that point are much more likely to finish college than people who come back to college at later ages. So it's not the case that later ages don't matter, but if you're really looking for the effects of enrollment decisions on the part of the university, budget cuts on the part of the state towards higher education, this is the group that's most likely to be affected. This is the group we should look to first. So then that's the second reason. This group is really exposed to these kinds of higher education policy changes more than any other group. And then finally, they're young. And so most of them will stay in California for most of their lives. And so this is a critical moment for them and for the state in terms of there are long-term implications for the decisions that are made at that age for their future and therefore for the state's economic future as well. Okay, so in this talk, first of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about higher education funding. And then I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail about responses of public colleges in California. And the three systems are UC, the University of California, CSU, the California State University System, and then finally the CCCs, the California Community Colleges. Then I'll talk a little bit about how enrollment has changed. Again, remember, the enrollment changes we're talking about are first-time freshmen, recent high school graduates. And then we'll talk about some long-term implications for California. So there are a lot of different ways that we could measure funding changes for higher education in California. This chart shows the percent of all general funds that go to higher education. And you'll see that the total share has declined from about 18% in the late 60s to early 70s to around 11% today. And even over the last 10 years or so, funding, once you adjust for inflation to the state's higher education institutions and for the Cal Grant program, have declined from about $13.3 billion of the state's general fund budget to about $11.7 billion, so a decline of more than 10% even over the last 10 years. The decline here represents a shift in state priorities, and maybe not one that's very well thought out. For example, the Department of Corrections budget has increased pretty strongly during this time. In the early 2000s, for the first time ever, we spent about the same amount on corrections as we spent on our public universities, that's UC and CSU. And then since then, in less than 10 years since those two budgets were about equal in terms of their general fund contributions, now the Department of Corrections gets about $1.65 for every $1 that goes to UC and CSU. So this reflects a changing set of priorities, whether, again, from a kind of thoughtful, planned out set of discussions or whether it's been more kind of responding to immediate budget fires is a valid question. But in any event, these are just the facts in terms of the numbers. We could also look at state funding per student. So I just talked a little bit about corrections, the corrections budget and the UC and CSU budgets. During that same time frame when corrections was increasing as a share of the budget and CSU and UC were declining, UC and CSU were still seeing enrollment growth, and the Department of Corrections actually had, in terms of the number of prisoners, was pretty flat during that period. When we look at general fund appropriations per full-time equivalent student, here again, always adjusting for inflation, so this is in 2010 dollars, we see pretty dramatic declines at UC and CSU in the area of about 50% over the last decade or so. Declines not so much, not so dramatic for the community colleges, although in the last 4 or 5 years there have been pretty substantial declines there as well. Another important point here in this slide is that community colleges, even though they haven't had the same kind of cuts in terms of the magnitude of the cuts, receive far less per student than UC or CSU. So they don't have a lot of room to cut to begin with. So we have not only shifting priorities within the state in terms of how we spend all of our general fund dollars, but also within the three public segments, we also see these shifting priorities. Here I'm showing you the percent of higher education general funds that go to the three systems. In the mid-1960s, almost half of all general fund expenditures for higher education went to UC. Today that's down to less than a third, and then you'll see that the community colleges have grown quite a bit as a share of general fund expenditures in California. It's important to keep in mind UC and CSU have other sources of funds, which we'll get to in a minute, than the community colleges do. And that brings us then to this discussion of how public colleges in California have responded to the budget cuts. So they've done a number of things. They've reduced expenses and they've raised tuition. So they've cut staff, courses, services. But from a student perspective, the most significant things that they've done have been to increase tuition and fees and to engage in what's called enrollment management. So first of all, let me talk about tuition and fees. This chart shows tuition and fees at UC and CSU across time. And you'll see that these lines are just almost vertically upward sloping in the most recent years. UC tuitions now exceed over $12,000 a year when you include campus fees. CSUs are over $6,000 a year. And this is a dramatic increase over just a relatively short time period. Certainly these lines were going up prior to the last few years, but it's really been in these last 4 or 5 years that we've seen these tremendously steep increases. These increases in California, as I said earlier, other states are having these same kinds of changes, but not as dramatic as California. So here I'm showing you comparisons between tuition and fees at UC campuses compared to similar colleges in the rest of the United States. And those similar colleges were identified on the basis of Carnegie classifications. These are very high research activity universities with at least 10,000 students. There are about 70 of those institutions in the United States. And what you see here is that as recently as 2007-8, UC was a little bit higher than those comparison campuses, but now is much, much higher than those comparison campuses in their tuition and fees, with a 50% increase over that time period, just those 3 years, compared to about a 24% increase in other states. And then on the bottom here, you see CSU has moved from being, I'm sorry, that should say average for CSU campuses on the bottom right here. CSU has gone from being actually substantially less expensive than their comparison institutions. And by 2010-11, still less expensive, but very rapid increases. So again, almost a 50% increase over that 3-year period. In 2011-12, the California universities went up again much faster than most other states, although we don't have complete data for 2011-12 for other states yet to do that comparison, but it's almost certainly going to show the same thing, which is the big picture here is UC has gone from being, and even earlier than this, among the most affordable public research universities in the country to being among the most expensive public research universities in the country. And CSU has gone from being very affordable to about middle of the pack. Okay, so that certainly has been one source of change that's been very much at the forefront of discussions in California and in the front of the minds of California families and their students. It is, in fact, the primary way that UC and CSU have recovered some, but not all, of the budget cuts that they've gotten from the state. And that is by increasing student tuition. Of course, they get increased revenue. They withhold a substantial share of that tuition for low-income and moderate-income students, so they don't get the full tuition increase coming in because a lot of it goes back out the door to pay for grants for low-income and middle-income students. But it is a way that they have backfilled some of the loss in state support. The community colleges have not had that same option available to them. They don't set their own tuition and fees, for example, and their tuition and fees are very low and don't provide a large source of funding for them compared to UC and CSU. Moreover, and in fact, what we've concluded in our report is probably the largest factor that has affected enrollment in California, is that UC and CSU have adopted policies that are specifically designed to limit enrollment. And they've adopted these policies because they are not getting funding from the state to enroll all the students that are eligible. So what UC has done is they've increased the share of students who are placed in what is called their referral pool. So when a student applies to UC, they select a campus or more than one campus that they want to go to, and they pay for the application for each campus that they're applying to. And if they are UC eligible, they are guaranteed a spot at a campus of the UC system, but not necessarily the campus or campuses of their choice. The most popular campuses, of course, are UCLA and Berkeley. Those have the highest admission criteria. So large numbers of students, and increasingly more and more students with the budget cuts, have been deferred from admission to Berkeley and UCLA and San Diego and other campuses that are in high demand to campuses that are in less demand. And those students are put in what's called the referral pool. So again, if I apply to, say, Berkeley, San Diego, and Los Angeles, and I'm UC eligible, meaning I've done everything I was supposed to do, but I don't get in because I don't meet the higher threshold of those campuses, I'm placed in a referral pool, and I'll be offered admission at another campus. Right now, the only other campus that is accepting referral students is UC Merced. So what's happened then is a lot of students who would have gone to a UC are not going because they're not getting into the campuses that they choose. And this isn't someone saying, oh, I'm just going to take my ball and go home. I don't want to go to that campus. Students aren't applying to UC Merced for a lot of reasons. UC, just like CSU, has a lot of students who commute. And one way that students and their families are able to afford the higher tuition and the higher costs is by having the student live at home or live in, with relatives or family members. So that if you are trying to get into UC San Diego and you're offered a spot at UC Merced, the costs aren't necessarily equivalent to you. And then also, you might be willing to spend $13,000 a year in tuition and fees at Berkeley or San Diego or UCLA, but you might not be willing to do that at UC Merced. At CSU, campuses have engaged in a similar kind of approach to limit enrollment. So each campus has an enrollment target. 16 out of the 23 campuses have more students applying for spots in those campuses than there are spaces available to them. And those spaces are restricted by the budget and the budget cuts, so that only 7 campuses in the CSU system will accept students who meet the minimum CSU requirements. So it's very similar to what's happening at UC. What's different at CSU is that as of last year at least, they had not developed a referral pool. They were talking about developing a referral pool. But if you apply, for example, to San Diego State University, which is one of the more popular campuses, their eligibility criteria are higher than the CSU minimum, so you might not get in. and you are not offered a slot at another campus. At UC, you would be eventually offered a spot at UC Merced, for example, if you were UC eligible. At CSU, it's kind of incumbent upon the student and their family to apply to a campus that is not impacted if they want to be guaranteed admission if they meet the CSU minimum eligibility criteria. And here I'm just showing you some kind of representative campuses of those that are impacted and those that are not impacted. The big picture here is that all of the large campuses are impacted, and the ones that are not impacted tend to be smaller or more isolated geographically. Okay, so what does all this mean for changes in enrollment rates of recent high school graduates? Well, the short answer is enrollment rates are declining. It's not necessarily a surprise given the tuition increases and given the enrollment management practices. And indeed, we see, for example, from the last few years, a decline in the share of all high school graduates that are going to UC or CSU has declined from about 22%, these are the blue bars, to less than 18%. And among A through G graduates, those are the students who have taken the college preparatory requirement courses of UC and CSU. It used to be that 2/3 of those students in California enrolled in either a UC or CSU. Now it's only somewhat over half of students who are at the top of their classes and have done all the college preparatory work required of them to gain admission to UC and CSU are actually enrolling in those campuses. So we've had a loss. This loss and decline in enrollment rates spans race and ethnic groups. The declines are less dramatic for Latino students, which is perhaps good news at least, a bit of a silver lining given the achievement gap concerns that we have. But they have declined for white and Asian students, and especially for African American students, and a lot of that decline is associated with a decline in African American student enrollment at CSUs. So overall, we see these declines are pretty consistent in terms of the magnitude of the declines, both at UC and CSU. So here, for example, among the A through G graduates, the share of high school graduates who are going to UC has declined from about 27% to 22%. And then at CSU, the share has declined from about 41% to about 33%. So in both cases, those differences represent about a 20% decline in the enrollment rates of recent high school graduates. Now, when we turn to community colleges, as I've said, they have in many ways fewer options available to them to limit the budget cuts that they're facing. So, for example, community colleges can't really turn away students like UC or CSU campuses can. They cannot deny them admission. And so what ends up happening at the community colleges is that there's a lot of kind of enrollment management that occurs through overcrowding of classes. So students just can't find the courses they need. And we see, in fact, some evidence that increasingly students are attending more than one community college than they had in the past, presumably to be able to get the courses that they do need. Santa Monica College has been in the news recently because they were suggesting offering additional courses at a much higher fee level for students who wanted to be in classes, but they just didn't have the funding to support them. But again, they can't really turn away students, so what happens is students kind of get turned away by not being able to find classes. We do see some increase, although very small, in the number of high school graduates who go to community colleges, and that's represented by the blue lines, the blue bars here. It's an important point for those of you who ever look at this kind of data, that if you don't adjust the community college data for non-reporting or misreporting, you end up with a pattern that suggests pretty notable declines in the enrollment of recent high school graduates to community colleges. And what happens is that in certain years, community colleges just don't report first-time freshmen, recent high school graduates, or they'll report 2001 year, then 5 the next year, then 2000 the next year, and 2000 the next year. And you can't really trust that 5, and you have to kind of figure out what's going on. And David and I have spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to fix that data. We have several different adjustment techniques we use. Overall, they generally all show this same kind of pattern, which is the blue bars, which are the more dependable ones. Okay, so then the big question is, where are they going? Well, we see very little change in private enrollment rates in California private AICCU accredited institutions. They've been around 3.5% of all recent high school graduates in the state for some time. The number of students who are enrolling in those institutions is going up as the number of high school graduates has gone up, but the enrollment rates, which is the critical statistic here, have remained about the same. We do see some increase in out-of-state enrollment, so I talked a little bit about that. Many of those people who are leaving California are students who would have been eligible for UC or CSU. They're going to, for the most part, surrounding states, and they're not necessarily going to private institutions in those states. They're going to public institutions in those states. So there's been some big increases in students going to Arizona, Oregon, and Washington. And I think there's been some news coverage of that as well. And then some of these students seem to be deferring college altogether. It's really hard to figure out where a student goes if they don't go to UC or CSU or they don't go somewhere in the state. What UC has done, for example, is used what's called the National Clearinghouse data and looked at students who were UC eligible and admitted but didn't go to UC. Where did they end up? And they find that a large share and an increasing share actually are going to CSUs, a notable share are going to private colleges, and to colleges out of the state. But they also find that in just the raw data, about 15% don't seem to show up at college anywhere. Now, the matching isn't complete, so the matching is supposed to match about 95%. So if 5% of those are just not matched, then it might be as many as 10% of those students are not going to college anywhere. Presumably, they're deferring college. Hopefully, they're not choosing never to go to college. But this is, of course, one of the big concerns. So what does this mean then for California going forward? When we put all this together and we turn this into numbers, it means that we have had a loss of about 20,000 first-time freshmen at UC and CSU. And as I said, that represents about 1/5 of the class of entering freshmen at UC and CSU in the most recent year that we have data for. At current completion rates, that means we will have 12,000 fewer baccalaureate degrees granted in California than we would have otherwise had if enrollment rates had remained at 2007 levels. So this represents a decline in just the last few years. This is an annual figure. It's big. It's certainly the wrong direction for the state. The economic implications for this are quite large. It is the case that college graduates earn substantially more than less educated members of the workforce. That college wage premium has gone up. It's almost twice as high now. Wages of a college graduate are almost twice as high now as for someone who has only graduated from high school. And unemployment rates, even now in the downturn, are far lower for college graduates than they are for less educated individuals. And in fact, this downturn, like many downturns previously, to the extent that they reset our economy, they tend to reset it in favor of more highly skilled and highly educated workers, and that often the permanent job losses are near the bottom of the educational and skill spectrum in the United States. And then third, we have a loss on our return on our investment. So there's the return on investment of the K-12 student, the primary expenditures, state expenditures that occur during your lifetime occur when you're a child and when you're very old, through medical care and then through education. So California's invested a lot of money in the K-12 system, arguably maybe not enough, but in any event, we've invested a lot. And then right when you've done everything right and you're eligible for college, we don't have enough slots in our state, and you leave the state, for example, that's a loss on our return on investment. There's also a return on investment. The Campaign for College Opportunity just released a report that looks at how much the state gets back for every $1 it spends on public higher education. And their estimate was about $4.50 of return for every $1 invested in higher education in California. And that return occurs because of these higher wages and therefore higher tax revenues that are generated by more highly educated workers. and also occurs through the decline in the demand for social and welfare services because of, again, more highly educated workers are much less likely to need those services. So there's a return on investment loss in that context as well. All right, so finally, well, what should policymakers do? Well, you know, it's easy to say, I guess, but reinvesting in higher education has to be part of the answer. There is no way that we're going to be able to reverse these trends completely through other measures. So I think the main message here is that policymakers need to realize that if we want to reverse these enrollment declines that we're seeing, we need to reinvest in higher education. And certainly there is a proposal that will go forward, the governor's tax proposal, that could lead to some additional revenues for higher education if it passes. Secondly, you know, certainly no matter what, it makes sense to spend higher education money as efficiently as possible. And there are different ways of considering doing that. One way, for example, would be to fund outcomes as well as enrollment. So, for example, right now, we fund students and seats, but we don't provide funding to colleges based on how many students complete a course or how many students earn a certificate or a degree. And so certainly there might be one way to kind of promote more efficiency within higher education spending is to make sure that we identify the outcomes we want and reward institutions for producing those outcomes, at the same time keeping in mind the equity considerations and the different challenges that different institutions face given their student populations. I think going forward, no matter what, helping families and students afford the very high cost of college is going to remain a very critical issue. California has done a lot in terms of our Cal Grant program, although there are proposals to cut that program to some extent as well. But we haven't done some other things that some other states have done, for example, and there are other proposals out there that might help families pay for the high cost of college. So one proposal that has been put out are deferred loans that students would pay back their tuition and fees based on a percentage of their income after they graduate. Another proposal that many states actually have already enacted are set tuition programs where parents pay into a tax-free account, and the state guarantees that if they pay into that account at a certain amount, that when their student is ready for college, their entire tuition and fees for that college will be paid for. So that creates a level of certainty so that even if tuition and fees go up more than had been anticipated, the state has guaranteed that they will honor the total amount of money that has been generated through those tax-deferred savings programs. But finally, I mean, getting back to the original point, I think it's important for policymakers to realize that these other things are worth doing and important to consider, but in some ways they're kind of fiddling around at the edges, and that the big, huge picture here is we've had hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars of cuts in higher education funding in California. There is obviously an effect. We've seen an effect on enrollment of first-time freshmen, recent high school graduates, and that if we want to reverse those trends, ultimately it's going to require some more investments in our higher education system. So that ends the formal comments. I'm happy to answer any questions. Before I get to the questions, I should note that we used a multitude of different data sets to do these analyses. We used data from the California Post-Secondary Education Commission, CPEC, which really doesn't even exist anymore, but thanks to the community colleges, still the data and the information they provide is still available to us. We also used data from the University of California Office of the President, the California State University Chancellor's Office, the California Community College Chancellor's Office. We used United States Department of Education IPEDS data. We used California Department of Education data on high school graduates. So there are a lot of different data sources that went into developing these numbers, LAO and finance numbers. A lot of these data sources some of you work on and are very familiar with, but that is the basis of the numbers that were presented here. Okay, so questions in the back here.
My first question is, in the beginning you were talking about the demand has increased for higher education, and that's very, very general, and you showed some of the, the students, the families, who's going. what I want to know is how is the demand correlated by what employers are actually looking for? I mean, are employers actually looking for bachelor's degrees? And to dive deeper, which particular areas or what programs of study?
So, employers are looking for more highly educated workers. They are looking for specific skills. It's certainly the case that if you graduate with a degree in computer science and electrical engineering, you're much more likely to get a job paying a pretty good wage than if you graduate with a degree in philosophy. Students are going into increasingly majors that are outside of the core humanities fields, and to some extent students are responding to those wage changes. But I don't necessarily think it's the role of the state to kind of determine how many slots we have in each department at every university in California. I don't think you're arguing that either. But I think that it is important to provide students and their families with information about labor market outcomes for students like them from the universities that they attend. And there is movement along that lines. There's the Gainful Employment Act and other measures that are being taken to provide more information. The California community colleges have done work looking at the value of certificates. So I think that that's all very important, and that should be used for consumer information so that students and their families can make educated choices about what they want to pursue. But it is the case that employers do value more highly educated workers. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. We see it in wage returns. But this chart I really love. I know it's hard to read, but let me just walk you through this. This just actually shows hourly wages by college major for California workers in 2010. This is based on people who earned a bachelor's degree. This is actually American Community Survey data. The sample sizes are quite large, which is why we're able to create a pretty substantial number of majors here. And you see here on the left is the average high school graduate worker in California earns $16 an hour. For someone who majors in the majors that are the least productive in terms of wages, those are actually people who majored in theology and religion. They still earn about $21 per hour, just those who earn a bachelor's degree. That's the blue lines. And then a fair number of people go on and earn graduate degrees. So you'll see, for example, a pretty big difference. Here's the philosophy and religious studies are down near the bottom. But for those who pursue graduate degrees, not necessarily in philosophy, those are people who got a bachelor's in philosophy and then pursue a graduate degree in some, perhaps philosophy, but probably law is what I'm guessing. They have much, much higher wages. And then you see biology is the other one that has the biggest spike for undergraduate versus graduate. Obviously, that's the medical field. And then here's, your computer scientists and engineers are over here making far, far more than a high school grad. But the main point here is just even for the majors that we often think of as being kind of, from an economic standpoint, not being that useful, they still do better than a high school graduate. Maybe that's a low bar given all the time and money you invest in going to college, but it's not as bad as I think a lot of people think.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Do you have a sense of where the bar for someone with a community college degree would fall on that?
So a lot of this, so it's really hard. We don't have good measures for, like the American Community Survey only asks for what your major was if you got a bachelor's degree.
Yeah,
and it does not ask what your major was if you got, or what you focused on if you got a certificate, for example. For an associate's degree, it is, so we do have associate's degree, and associate's degree I didn't show you on there, but it is further up than high school graduate, of course, but it's still lower than almost any college major. And the associate, in fact, the Campaign for College Opportunity, I don't know if there's someone here from there who might want to talk about this. They looked at returns to education for people who had a bachelor's degree versus those who had some college but no degree, and there was a pretty substantial difference between those two groups. Yes, okay.
Is there any data on the number of California freshmen going abroad for an education because it may be cheaper, say, in Ireland or Australia? And also, do you have any information about increasing recruitment by the UCs, I think especially the UCs, for out-of-state and international students?
Right. So
Good question.
I don't know of a good data source on U.S. students going, or California students going abroad. I think there's some data on U.S. students going abroad. I think it's most common for those students to do a year abroad rather than to go and earn their degree abroad. My sense is that's probably still a pretty small flow, but I don't know for certain. The data that I showed about students leaving California, they were going to other states. And then on the return flow, there are students who come into California from other states. So when I talked about more students leaving California, that was on a net basis. The net flow out has gone up. For students coming into California, certainly UC more so, I think, than, well, I know this. UC more so than CSU is accepting students from out of state. And the reason for that is because those students more than pay their full share of the costs of educating them. In fact, my understanding is they help subsidize even some of the in-state students, so that it is a kind of revenue neutral or even money maker for UCs to admit those students. And they increasingly are doing so. There's a big issue or controversy is in California. I think a lot of the public thinks, oh, that means that they're displacing California high school graduates. And I think the answer is no, they're not. If it wasn't for the high tuition and fees those students are paying, the university wouldn't have a slot at all for them or for the California student. There would just be, they would have to cut expenses, presumably faculty and other kinds of expenses, rather than admitting more California students because they don't have the money to accept more California students. And then increasingly, other states are recruiting in California. Other Western states, I know last time I checked, it's been a couple years now, but Oregon, University of Oregon used to have more recruiters in California than they had in Oregon. And it seems to have paid off when you look at the number of California students who are going to Oregon to the University of Oregon. I already got you once, so I'm going to go behind you here. Willard?
Sort of a methodological question. Through the ACS data that you have, are you able to determine how many of the those who stay in California actually leave California after they graduate? And then on the flip side, those who leave California for an education, how many of those come back?
Yeah, so one thing, right, you might, if California students are leaving to go to another state, and then they're getting educated at that state's dime on their higher tuition that they're having to pay, so don't forget that. But then they come back to California, maybe it's not such a big problem. The data on migration of recent college graduates is what I've looked at. So I cannot identify whether you graduate from the University of Oregon this year and the next year you're in California. That's just not available in the data sets. But what is available is I can look at recent college graduates, people who have earned a bachelor's degree who are young, who are, say, between 20 and 26 years old, and look at their migration patterns. And it is the case that the vast majority of people, and I actually did this, I know where you were born. I don't necessarily know where you graduated from high school, but I know where you were born as well in this data. So I have looked at that, and it turns out that the vast majority of people who are young, college-educated adults stay in the state where they lived last year, regardless of whether they were born in California or not. So that's a kind of convoluted way to get to the answer, which is I think a large share of them don't return, at least not in the short run. Maybe over the long run, a substantial share do. We don't have good data on it. But it's certainly a bad public policy to think that, well, we'll send them to another state and we'll just hope that they come back to California, especially given that they are applying to California universities and would be very happy to find a slot for them here, for themselves here. Okay, let's see. I'm going to go up front here. I don't think
I had kind of a follow-up question about looking at transfer agreements. Were you able to distinguish any of that data to track an increase in transfer agreement students? Because of the tuition increases, for example, they have to go to a less expensive school and then try and transfer the last year or last 2 years?
Yeah. So the next stage of this is to look more explicitly at how community colleges are managing the cuts and then what's happening to student outcomes at community colleges. So that's work that we've just started. But I would say that when you look at like the CSU campuses that are impacted, and remember impacted means that they can't accept all the students that are eligible, there are 16 that are impacted for first-time freshmen. 15 out of those 16 are also impacted for transfer students. So my sense and my guess is probably that transfer students are also feeling the space crunch at UC and CSU.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yes?
Hi, Helen. Thank you for the presentation. So your report says that the enrollment at the public universities has been going down, and at the Student Aid Commission, we showed during that same time period the number of Cal Grants to the public universities, the paid Cal Grants, have gone up considerably. So it would appear that the state, while defunding the higher education segments, has done a good job at protecting access for the lower income students. But I'm wondering if in your research you have any insight whether there are more lower income students at the public universities because the economy has been so bad. Are the universities doing maybe recruiting and admitting more lower income students, or are there some other reasons that we're not aware of?
Right. So first of all, let me be very clear. What I'm talking about here are enrollment rates. Mm-hmm. So it's the share of high school graduates. The number of high school graduates has gone up. Mm-hmm. So the actual number of students enrolling is not down as much as the rates are down. Okay. And then you're right. The Cal Grant program has been, in some ways, what has saved the universities from having, I think, even bigger reductions than they would have otherwise had. And that the Cal Grant program, which itself now is facing some potential changes, increasing GPA, for example, of students who are eligible, which would reduce, of course, the number of students who are eligible for Cal Grants. But the Cal Grant program has been instrumental in providing spaces and not spaces, but funding for students at UC and CSU. UC and CSU accept a substantial share of students who are low income. Compared to its peer institutions, UC is, I think, near the top, if not at the top, in terms of the share of students that are from low income families. But what we examined in this study was these enrollment rate declines across race and ethnic group, and we saw them going down for every group, not so much for Latinos as for African Americans. When we looked at yield rates by income at UC, we saw that they were going down for every group, but the low-income students are still more likely to go than the high-income students. So what that says to me is that the grants that have been given to low-income students at UC, not just through the Cal Grant program, but also through UC's own tuition grant program, and at CSU, have kept the cuts from harming low-income students more than they otherwise would have. Right? Yeah.
Yes, given the trend of us losing those college graduates, at what point will that impact the economic recovery of the state? At what point will we not have those college graduates to fuel the economy to continue to grow? Have you looked at where those are going to intersect in the future, where we'll be running out of qualified workers?
Right. So it already impacts the state, I would say, and certainly. We know that, for example, startups new companies are much more likely to be established, and not just high tech, any new company is much more likely to be established by a more highly educated person. And people who start up companies who have higher levels of education have startups that are more successful. Magnus Lofstrom at PPIC has done some work looking at entrepreneurship and how it varies with educational attainment. So I think already then just losing people who have done very well educationally means it will impact our economy. In terms of measuring, reaching that 1 million goal that we had identified earlier, this is clearly in the wrong direction. So losing 20,000 additional students a year, over the next 20 years, well, actually 2005 is only, 13 years away now. So, that's 260,000 students if we just continue where we are right now. And that's a large chunk of that 1 million shortage that we identified. So I would say, yeah, we're already on the path of going in the wrong direction and having economic impacts in the future. I'm going to get all the way in the back here because you've raised your hand for a while.
What's your take on the role that career colleges could play in picking up some of this slack, I guess, particularly when it comes to community colleges, which would be more comparable than UC or CSU?
Yeah, so career colleges, and I would say also, though, the community, well, career colleges can pick up some of the slack. The LAO has a report out that shows some of the percentages of students who are going to different kinds of colleges, the enrollment rates at different kinds of colleges, including for-profit privates and not-for-profit privates. I think that the reality in California is that the vast majority of higher education enrollment is in one of the public segments. It's about 80%. The vast majority of bachelor's degrees in California are awarded by one of the public segments. But that the privates have a larger role to play in certificates and career technical programs, and they have a larger role to play in graduate programs in California as well. And those are two places where I think the privates can and should realize that the demand is there and try to pick up some of the slack. But I'm not an expert on the specific fields within the career tech programs and how those might be accommodated. Again, when we do some more of this community college work and looking at certificates at community colleges, I think we'll have a better sense of how those compare to the private sector in California. So I don't mean to at all understate the role of the private institutions. And I'm looking at my private institution friend now. And I wish that the private institutions would be willing and able to pick up more of the slack. I think they're facing their own kind of cost constraints and budget issues as well, but that would be a great solution for California if we were able to accommodate more of this through private institutions that were able to provide grants and aid to students who needed them. And we've hit a little bit after 1 o'clock, so I know some of you probably, and some have already left and need to go, so please feel free to get up and leave if you need to, but I'm happy to continue answering questions. Yeah.
So, first statement, there's a difference between private and nonprofit private. I'd like to make sure to make that distinction. The second, your 220,000 shortfall between now and 2025, is that in from the 1 million or on top of the 1 million?
Maybe I wasn't clear. So the 1 million shortfall is the projection for people with a bachelor's degree or more. The 20,000 is this new loss that we've experienced over the last few years. And so it means we're going in the wrong direction. Yeah, so if we had just maintained our previous levels, we would have had 20,000 times 13 years, 260,000 more students going to. Not all of them would have graduated from college, so I'm just doing the math in my head. That's like maybe 150,000 additional college degrees. But yeah, it's going in the wrong direction, so it's on top of. Yeah.
You mentioned privatization without really discussing that. I'm wondering, and I'll give you a couple examples of whatever the good work that's being done, the BP funding of energy research, and then I thought I just heard, correct me if I'm wrong, there's an Anheuser-Busch chair in brewing science over at UC Davis. I think when it comes to talking about oil severance tax or alcohol tax, for which there's a code of silence over at the Capitol despite strong polling support, it's personal for me because my daughter's graduate program that she was going to enroll in at Chico State, she's a UC alum, she was just told 3 weeks ago it's suspended for 2 years. And yet the Chico Police Department was down here with their mounted patrol and told me they were practicing for St. Patrick's Day when the thousands of students were in Sacramento. Some of you may have seen them there. So politically, when it comes to having an honest conversation about revenue, I think the privatization issue raises a concern that I certainly have.
Well, so for example, some of the private sources of revenue that UC Davis and UCs are getting, CSUs are getting, are not resources that are available for undergraduate instruction. So BP is not paying UC to provide more faculty to provide more undergraduate instruction for California students. They're paying for research, very specific research. So a lot of times, if you look at the UC budget, the share that comes from the state is actually pretty small. But that share from the state is what funds undergraduate instruction. So that's why it matters for understanding what's happening to the slots that are available to your daughter and other Californians. And the research money, while it's great and important, and or maybe not so great, depending on what you think of the source, while that provides a lot of resources for the university, those resources are really all about research, not about instruction. So I don't know if that answered your question or not. Okay, good. Any other questions? All right, thanks very much for your attention. Appreciate it.